Now we're ready to start marking up the text of our document, and this is where the new semantic elements of HTML5 really add value. What I'm going to do first is to introduce the concept of a document outline, which illustrates very much how HTML5 now gives us much more flexibility and precision in defining the basic structure of your document. And this is particularly important for assistive technologies to be able to automatically navigate around your document and identify the key features in the document. So having done that, then I'll start demonstrating the use of some of the new HTML5 semantic elements. So what are document outlines? They're quite simple in a sense. They're a slightly higher level of abstraction of the document object model which we saw earlier on. It's capturing where the document starts, what are the main sections, and what are their respective subsections. So one produces something which is very much like a document tree, but pulling out the key sections. As I said, a higher level of abstraction because one's not looking at all of the elements in the document object model, but the top level structure of your document. Prior to HTML5, the only way to creating a document outline was to use the level headings, the H1 to H6 elements, and that led to a number of issues, and I'll illustrate one of those in a few moments. HTML5 provides a lot stronger support, and again, I'll illustrate that by taking the example I'll show you in a moment and doing it better in HTML5, and then we'll expand on it a little bit more. Just start using some of the new semantic elements and showing you how much expressivity or expressiveness, I'm not quite sure which is the right term, HTML5 gains in defining your document. Why is this important? Well, it's important for the reason I just gave. It's important for screen readers to be able to interpret your document, the structure of the document, and automatically navigate around the document. It's also important for your designers to have an unambiguous view of the structure and possibly, if needed, to automatically pull out the document outline from the semantic elements in your HTML5, and I'll show you a tool for doing that in a few moments. So what one would normally look for in any document structure is a single root, a single point of entry. That tends to be implied by the header part of the document, and prior to HTML5, the only way of identifying the header, the entry point in a sense, was to use a div element. I've not mentioned divs as elements up until now quite deliberately because I don't want to get into any kind of habit of using them, but divs are generic elements, tags identifying generic elements, which gives a block element but with no predefined semantics at all. So what happened in the past was that for the header of a page or a section, the web page writer would use an ID tag and label it header or some other name. Problem with that is that although the right author of the document knew what they meant, and maybe some of their colleagues knew what they meant, the screen readers and any other assistive technology was not able and was required not to have any semantics implied by the name of an ID, because you could call that anything and it makes just as much semantic sense. There's no commonality there. But the implication is that this is supposed to be the top level header of the document, and there's an implied semantics there, but no actual definition of a semantics. So for this this sort of high-level blog, we've got a header on a particular subject line. I've given it an H1 level, and then we've got two other divs where we've got entries to the blog. And again, I've wanted to give those level 1 headings because they're block elements which have got some meaning as a piece of content, and so it makes sense in a way to start a heading hierarchy in those. So a level 1 heading, which by embedding it into a div, as I said, div in itself is no semantics, it's just a block element, where I've tried to give it a semantics, but I could just as well call that Wibble. The screen reader and any other assistive technology is not allowed to make any kind of interpretation of what that ID is. With the two divs which I've given a class attribute to, and that's the second of the two attributes which I can freely choose the name of. Here we're saying both of those belong to the same class, so in advanced lectures when we start looking at, in advanced course when we start looking at styling, then cascading style sheets can be used to style those in a common style. But I've given those the same class, and again I'm trying to give a semantics that based on the name of the class for the div, and any assistive technology again cannot understand my internal interpretation of that. So I've tried to give these level 1 headings where my assumption is that these are in a sense substructures to the overall structure defined by the header div. Now if I run this through a document outliner, then this is what I get. I've actually got, by processing just on the basis of the headings, which is what the only thing the outliner can do, it puts all of those three H1 headings at an equal level. So we've actually got not a tree, but simply an unstructured document with 3 sections pitched at the same level. So any screen reader is not going to understand that that first header is something which is a route into the rest of the document. So we need to do something about that. What I can do, and this is what one would have done in HTML4, is to force the issue by lowering the level of the headings inside. So I am required to have one level 1 heading as my entry point into the document, and then everything else beneath it, no matter what my intention behind the structure, has to start with a level 2 heading or below. So having made this slight change, then I do get the document structure I want, but I hacked it. That wasn't my intention. It's not expressing my intention. Those are each of those entries is a semantically well-defined chunk of content, and I want to be able to have complete freedom as to how I structure within that semantic lump of content. Perhaps more importantly, if one generalizes this not from a weblog but to a large page where I may have divided up the content to different people with responsibility for writing the different content, what they have to do in order to be able to insert a section into my document, they have to ask me as the overriding designer of the document what level heading they need to start with. And again, in terms of distributed working, that simply doesn't make sense. If they are producing a well-defined section of content, then they ought to have the freedom to be able to choose the structuring of the levels of the heading and be able to have that inserted into the master document at a later date without having to look at dependencies on how to fix it so that it makes it seem part of a structure of a document outline. So HTML sorts that out for us. HTML5 sorts that out for us properly. I must give one caveat. So versions of Internet Explorer prior to 9 won't understand all of the semantic elements that I'm going to introduce. I'm making the assumption for the time being that you, as a state-of-the-art web developer, are also using state-of-the-art browsers to experiment with, and I hope you're doing little bits of experimentation as you go on with the course. We'll certainly come to that again at the end of this chapter. So use a modern browser, Internet Explorer 9 at the time of writing, or any of the current versions of Chrome, Opera, Safari, Firefox, etc. And these elements will work for you. In the next chapter, I will show you how to fix it, because although you can control your own choice of browser, you can't control the choice of all your customers, and you will want to make all of this work for versions of Internet Explorer down to 6, and I'll show you how to do that in the next chapter. So with that caveat, let's start to see how to do this properly. We'll introduce two new elements to start off with, a header and an article. So this is giving me the structure that I really wanted in that simple weblog kind of page that I showed you a little while ago. So I don't have to create an ID with header as a name of a tag, to define a header element is part of the semantics, and we can use a header region for a whole page, for a section, or an article. I'll introduce you to articles now, and we'll come to sections a little bit later. With an article, that defines a self-contained piece of content. So for our entries in the weblog, then an article makes sense. That's a well-defined, self-contained piece of content, and the author of that article has every right to be able to choose the heading hierarchy within that document, and they can now without messing up the document outline. So let's take a look at that. And now we've got this modified a little bit. I've put a header in there with a level 1 heading within it, and I've got two articles. Those are my pieces of weblog content, and each of those has got its own level 1 heading, and let's look at the outline of that. That works. So it's taken the header as the entry point for the whole document, then it's seen two articles which are belonging to that, and they are at an equal level, although they've got some sort of ordering on the page, possibly temporal, but in terms of a document hierarchy, an outline of the document hierarchy, they're siblings. And that's exactly what we want, but with a good structure to it. Let's enrich that a little bit more before I introduce some of the other elements. And one of the things which we in a weblog would want to do is to put in the publication date of each of those two pieces of content. And what I've done here now is to do what I said I could do. I've introduced into each article a header, and I've blocked together using that header a date time stamp and the level 1 heading for that piece of content. So I've introduced a new element, and again this has got a machine readable date time stamp, and there's a reasonable degree of flexibility in the the format of that date timestamp. Here we've got a good practice, sensible date timestamp starting with year, then month, then day of the year, and that's sortable alphanumerically, so that's a logically sensible way of recording date times. And it's got a pub date Boolean there, I'll show you that in a minute, and an English language, a natural language representation of the date. So timestamp here gives a machine readable, again, definition of the timestamp, and a Boolean pub date, which is optional. If I include that, then it's saying that if embedded in an article, that's the publication date of the article. If it's in a header for the whole document, then that's the publication date of the whole document. If it's not there, then it's if you don't include the pub date, then that will assume the date refers to the entire content. So to give that in a little bit more detail for date times, the requirements are the machine readable timestamp, the optional Boolean pub date, the human readable text, which is what is displayed in the browser, and now we've got something which can be quite clearly interpreted by any assistive technology. We can, as it says, date time, we can expand that to include a time if we wish, by including after the date a t, then the actual time you want, plus an offset from GMT, and it, again, follow that by the natural language expression of the date time for a human reader to read. The only slight downside of that, it is the author of the web's the page's responsibility to make sure that date timestamp and the human readable date and time are consistent with each other. Let's now look at some more elements. I mentioned section, and that captures a logical regional grouping of a content. So think of a section along the line, say, of the sports section of a newspaper. The section in turn can have articles about individual performance of sports people within the sports section, and those articles in turn can have sections themselves. So section and article can be inside each other respectively, and it's your choices to how you do that. Generally, a section will have a number of articles within it, and an article may well have a number of sections within that. And again, this is why having within an article full control over the level headings makes perfect sense. Another region which is important for assistive technology to be able to identify is the navigation element for the page. Prior to HTML5, then the navigation element was typically done as a div with an unordered list. Now you put the links for the pages inside a nav bar, and we'll see that in use in a little while, in a few lectures time, after I've covered links within HTML5. Aside, another key one to get clear in your mind, this is not about sidebars, which it can be confused with. An aside is a piece of secondary content associated with a region. So for an article or a section within an article, perhaps you've got a little bit of extra explanation about a certain term or a certain phrase, then that belongs in an aside. The sort of content that goes in sidebars is typically additional content and not related to a particular region or an article. And then finally, we've got headers, so we ought to have footers as well. And again, a footer can be associated with a full page, or it could be associated with a region or a section of a web page. So in general, one can produce a complex structure like this, where we've got the body divided up into something which will produce a clear and unambiguous outline as intended in any of the document outliners. Check it on the one I showed you a little bit earlier, and then you'll be assured that a screen reader or any other assistive technology will be able to navigate itself around this your document. Within that, we've got a section which has got some a header of its own and then 2 articles within it. Each of those articles has their own headers and footers, and then some content, 1 or more paragraphs, possibly an aside associated with a paragraph, and at a level, same sort of level, we've got something which, by its positioning on my diagram, is clearly going to be marked as a sidebar, but the designer may place that at their choice. It doesn't necessarily have to be on that side, but that's some extra content, possibly a navbar to related documents, and that gives you a view of a kind of outline that's achievable using the HTML5 elements. So what I've tried to get across is the key thing about why structuring your documents matters. It makes the semantics of your document, the high-level outline of your document, completely unambiguous. That means that the designers know how the various parts are related, and perhaps more importantly, any kind of assistive technology will be able to navigate itself around the structure of your document. Having done that, then I've introduced some of the HTML5 semantic elements to enable you to define a clear structure for your document. That's not the end of the story, because there are a few more semantic elements which I would like to introduce, but what I want to do in the next few lectures is to go through some more parts of a document, variants, and then we'll produce a final wrap-up lecture with a more extensive example of their use in an example document.